Look at this building from 1873. No electricity in the plans, no modern HVAC systems, yet perfect acoustics that engineers today cannot replicate. Ventilation so advanced that air circulates without a single fan. And here's the problem. We're told these structures were built by candlelight with hand tools, but the math doesn't add up. Over the next 15 minutes, I'll walk you through 7 documented observations that official history struggles to explain. I've spent 2 years comparing architectural patents, city records, and photographic evidence from 43 cities across 4 continents. What I found isn't a conspiracy theory, it's a pattern of questions that nobody seems willing to address publicly. By the end, you'll see why some researchers believe we're not looking at primitive construction, but at the remnants of a technological approach we've somehow forgotten. Stay with me, because the deeper we go, the stranger this gets. Let me show you something that stopped me cold when I first noticed it. The main reading room of the Library of Congress, completed in 1897. The acoustic properties in that space allow a whisper from one corner to be heard clearly 170 feet away in the opposite corner. No microphones, no speakers, just geometry and materials. When acoustic engineers from MIT analyzed the structure in 2008, their report noted something unusual. The mathematical precision required to achieve this effect would demand computational modeling that didn't exist in the 19th century. The curves, the angles, the material densities, all calibrated to frequencies that builders supposedly couldn't measure. The official explanation? Talented craftsmen with good intuition. But here's where it gets interesting. That same acoustic phenomenon appears in dozens of buildings from the same era. The Royal Albert Hall in London, the Palais Garnier in Paris, the Chicago Auditorium building, all constructed within a 30-year window, all exhibiting acoustic properties that require mathematical precision we associate with modern computer-aided design. Some of these buildings have acoustic sweet spots that align with frequencies we didn't officially discover until the 20th century. I'm not making a claim here, I'm observing a pattern. Now, let's talk about climate control. The Bradbury Building in Los Angeles finished in 1893. 5 stories, central atrium, wrought iron railings everywhere. The temperature inside remains remarkably stable year-round without modern air conditioning. How? The design creates a natural convection system. Hot air rises through the atrium and escapes through roof vents. Cool air is drawn in through ground-level passages. The entire building breathes like a living organism. Engineers who studied it noted that the airflow patterns suggest an understanding of thermodynamics that was, according to our textbooks, still being formalized in academic papers at that exact time. Again, official history credits intuitive genius. But when you find the same passive cooling systems in the Utah State Capitol, the Allegheny County Courthouse, and government buildings across 3 continents, you start wondering, was this intuition or was this knowledge? Here's something even stranger. Many of these buildings feature ornate domes topped with elaborate spires. We're told these are purely decorative, aesthetic choices, but researchers examining the metallurgy have found something curious. Many of these spires contain copper and iron in specific ratios. Some are hollow, some have internal chambers. When you look at the architectural drawings that survived, you sometimes find notations about atmospheric electricity and telluric currents, terms that sound almost mystical to modern ears. Nikola Tesla, working in the 1890s, talked extensively about drawing power from the atmosphere. He built towers designed to transmit electricity wirelessly. His Wardenclyffe Tower, constructed in 1901, had a copper dome and a deep ground connection. The design principles? Remarkably similar to the architectural elements we see in these older buildings. Tesla himself mentioned studying ancient architectural principles in his notebooks, though he never specified what he meant. Was he rediscovering something or inventing something new? The official narrative says invention, but the timeline creates questions. These ornate buildings with their conductive spires and grounding systems were already standing when Tesla began his experiments. Some were decades old. If they were purely decorative, why the specific metallurgy? Why the grounding rods that go dozens of feet into the earth? Why the mathematical precision in their placement? I found a maintenance record from the Philadelphia City Hall dated 1903. It mentions replacing discharge points on the tower spire and notes that during storms, the apparatus functions as designed. What apparatus? The document doesn't elaborate. It assumes the reader already knows. That assumption bothers me because today we don't know. Let me give you one more example before we move forward. The Natural History Museum in Vienna, completed in 1889. The building features over 200 rooms, each with different natural lighting characteristics depending on the exhibits planned for that space. Rooms for minerals get north light. Rooms for paintings get controlled indirect light. This wasn't trial and error. The architectural specifications show precise calculations for sun angles throughout the year, accounting for Vienna's latitude and the building's orientation. The level of photometric knowledge this required was, according to our understanding, cutting-edge research at that exact moment in history. So here's the observation. Buildings from the late 19th century demonstrate applied knowledge of acoustics, thermodynamics, atmospheric electricity, and photometrics that was supposedly theoretical at the time of construction. Either we have the timeline wrong, or we're missing something about how knowledge was transmitted and applied in that era. And here's what really makes you think. After 1920, this stops. The elaborate domes disappear. The passive climate systems are replaced with mechanical ones. The acoustic precision gives way to spaces that need electronic amplification. We call this progress, but in some measurable ways, the buildings got simpler, not more sophisticated. Why would architectural knowledge move backwards? That question leads us somewhere unexpected, because when you start looking at what happened between 1870 and 1920, you find a pattern of destruction that's hard to ignore. And I mean that literally. Cities burned, records vanished, and after the smoke cleared, the architecture changed. But before we get to the fires, there's something about these buildings' energy systems that nobody wants to discuss on the record. And when you see the technical drawings that survived, you'll understand why this makes modern engineers very uncomfortable. The drawings I'm about to describe aren't hidden in some secret vault. They're in public archives. You can request them yourself. Most people just don't know to look. In the New York Public Library's Map Division, there's an architectural plan from the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition. It shows the main building, which covered 21 acres. The detail I want you to focus on is small, easy to miss. On the dome structure, there's a notation, atmospheric collection array, copper-zinc alternation, ground return via foundation matrix. There's a small technical drawing showing a spiral of alternating metal bands inside the dome structure connected to metal rods that descend through the building into the ground. The architect's name on the document, Henry Pettit and Joseph Wilson, both respected conventional designers. Nothing in their other work suggests radical electrical experimentation, yet here's this notation, matter of fact, as if it's standard practice. I've shown this document to 3 electrical engineers. All 3 had the same response. This describes a basic capacitor array coupled with a grounding system. The alternating metals would create a potential difference. The dome shape would collect atmospheric charge. The ground connection would complete a circuit. It's rudimentary by today's standards, but it's functional electrical theory. In 1876, the official narrative says Edison didn't develop practical electrical lighting until 1879. The first power station opened in 1882. So what was this dome doing 3 to 6 years earlier? And why is it drawn like it's unremarkable? Here's where I need to be very careful about what I claim versus what I observe. I'm not saying these buildings powered entire cities. I'm saying the architectural documents contain electrical concepts that predate what we're taught was the invention of electrical systems. That's a fact. The interpretation is where things get murky. Some researchers look at these designs and see a lost technology of free energy. Others see primitive experiments that didn't work, which is why they were abandoned. Still others suggested this was standard electrical knowledge that simply wasn't yet codified in patents and textbooks. All three interpretations use the same evidence. None can be definitively proven. What we can prove is this. Dozens of major buildings from the 1870s through the 1890s feature copper domes, elaborate spires with metallic elements, and deep ground connections. The architectural language used to describe these elements often references atmosphere, charge, potential, and discharge. This language appears across different countries, different architects, different building types.
Let me give you specifics. The Minnesota State Capitol completed in 1905. The dome is covered in pure copper sheets weighing over 300,000 pounds. That's not decorative necessity. Copper is expensive. Gold leaf would have been lighter and more visually impressive for less money, but they used copper. The architectural specifications note that the copper must maintain electrical continuity and be isolated from the structural steel except at grounding points. Why specify electrical isolation unless you're expecting electrical activity? The building also features a star pattern in the floor of the rotunda, made of different types of stone. Each point of the star uses a different mineral composition: marble, granite, limestone, semi-precious stones. A tour guide told me it's artistic symbolism, but I found a letter in the Minnesota Historical Society archives from the architect, Kaz Gilbert, mentioning that the floor pattern was designed with telluric considerations in mind. Telluric means relating to the earth. Telluric currents are natural electrical phenomena in the ground. Was Gilbert just being poetic, or was he describing a functional design element? I don't know. And here's the frustrating part. Nobody seems to have asked him while he was alive. This happens over and over in my research. There are hints, technical terms, design specifications that suggest knowledge of electrical and energetic principles, but there's rarely explicit explanation. It's like reading half a conversation. You can infer what they might be talking about, but you can't be certain. The Salt Lake City and County Building, finished in 1894, massive structure, central tower reaching 300 feet, topped with a copper-clad spire. The foundation includes a network of copper rods driven 60 feet into the ground in a geometric pattern. The official purpose? Lightning protection. But the pattern is radial, extending outward from the center of the building like spokes on a wheel. Lightning protection doesn't require that geometry. A few grounded rods would suffice. So why the elaborate pattern? I contacted the city engineer's office. They sent me scanned maintenance records from 1937 when the building underwent electrical upgrades. The workers' notes mention removing old copper earthing system, purpose unknown, appears decorative. They pulled out thousands of pounds of copper from beneath the building. Some of it was sold for scrap. The geometric pattern was destroyed. Did they just throw away evidence of a functional system, or was it really just overly elaborate lightning protection? We can't know now. The physical evidence is gone.
Let me shift to a different type of building: train stations. Grand Central Terminal in New York, Pennsylvania Station before its demolition, Union Station in Washington, D.C., all built in the same era, all featuring massive vaulted ceilings, often with ornate metallic elements. The acoustic properties in these spaces are remarkable. Announcements made from specific points can be heard throughout the entire concourse without amplification. Some stations have whispering galleries where sound carries in unexpected ways. The official explanation is that these are happy accidents of good design. But I found an interview from 1947 with an elderly architect named Thomas Hastings who worked on the original Pennsylvania station. He mentioned that the senior architects on the project insisted on specific geometric ratios for the vaulting. He said they used harmonic proportions based on older European traditions that he didn't fully understand himself. He built what he was told to build, and it worked beautifully. But he admitted he couldn't explain why those specific proportions were necessary. Older European traditions. What does that mean? Where did those proportions come from? If you go back further, you find similar language. Christopher Wren, rebuilding London after the Great Fire of 1666, wrote about using ancient geometric principles in his church designs. Many of his churches have extraordinary acoustics. St. Paul's Cathedral features a whispering gallery where a whisper travels over 100 feet along the curved wall. Wren's writings suggest he was applying knowledge, not experimenting. But where did the knowledge come from? His notes reference the old builders without specifying who they were or when they worked. This pattern of vague references to earlier knowledge appears throughout architectural history. It's always just out of reach, always assumed to be understood by the reader, so it's never fully explained. Here's another specific case, the Library of Congress building I mentioned earlier. There's a power substation in the basement, added during renovations in the 1920s. The workers who installed it wrote reports that are now in the library's own archives. Multiple workers noted that they found existing electrical conduits in the walls that weren't on any building plans. Copper tubes, insulated with some kind of ceramic material, running vertically through the structure. The tubes were empty, they didn't connect to anything. The workers assumed they were abandoned from an earlier electrical system and ignored them. But the building was finished in 1897. Permanent electrical wiring in walls wasn't standard practice until the early 1900s, so why were there insulated copper conduits in a building that predated standard electrical installation methods? I submitted a research request to examine those conduits. I was told they were removed during a renovation in the 1980s and disposed of. No one thought to preserve them for historical analysis. They were just old wiring. Maybe they were. Or maybe they were something else.
Now, you might be thinking this is just a series of odd coincidences. Old buildings have quirks. Architects tried things that didn't pan out. Fair enough. But there's a moment when coincidence becomes pattern. And that moment, for me, came when I mapped every major architectural innovation against every major urban fire between 1870 and 1920. The timeline isn't just suspicious, it's methodical. Let me show you one more technical element before we move to the fires. The ventilation systems. The Dakota building in New York, completed in 1884. It has a central courtyard with specific geometric proportions. The building's design creates a natural air circulation that maintains relatively stable temperatures year-round. Fresh air enters through ground-level vents, circulates up through the courtyard, and exits through roof vents. It's a passive system requiring no energy input. The architect, Henry Hardenberg, designed several buildings with similar features. When asked about his ventilation approach in an 1890 interview, he said he was applying principles observed in older structures in Europe, but didn't elaborate on which structures or which principles. Again, that reference to older knowledge. The frustrating thing is that these passive systems work. They're energy efficient. They provide superior air quality compared to many modern HVAC systems. Yet, after the 1920s, they almost completely disappear from architectural practice. Buildings become dependent on mechanical systems that require constant energy input. We're told this is progress. Mechanical systems are more reliable, more controllable. That's true, but it's also true that the old systems worked, used no energy, and lasted for decades with minimal maintenance. So why the complete abandonment of a functional technology? The standard answer is that labor costs rose, making complex passive systems uneconomical. But that doesn't explain why the knowledge itself seems to have vanished. It's one thing to choose not to use a technique because it's expensive. It's another thing to lose the ability to use it at all. And when you look at architectural education in the early 20th century, something strange happened. The curriculum changed, certain subjects disappeared, and right around the same time, many of the reference buildings started burning down. I want to emphasize, I'm not claiming a conspiracy. I'm noting a timeline. Between 1870 and 1920, there was a massive shift in architectural practice. Buildings went from exhibiting certain advanced passive systems to not having them. The generation of architects who built the complex structures mostly died without writing comprehensive technical manuals. Their knowledge was primarily transmitted through apprenticeship, and when that generation passed, much of the knowledge went with them. That's one explanation. It's plausible. Knowledge is lost all the time when it's not properly documented. But there's another observation that makes this explanation less satisfying. Many of these architects did write. They published papers, gave lectures, trained students.
One case involved the Chamber of Commerce building. The owner claimed it had a rooftop atmospheric collection system made of copper and zinc elements. The insurance company argued this was decorative and not functional, therefore worth less. The case was settled out of court. The building was never rebuilt with those elements. Another case involved the Tremont House Hotel. 6 stories, one of the tallest buildings in Chicago at the time. The owner's claim mentioned integrated air circulation apparatus built into the walls. The insurance company's assessor wrote that he'd never seen such features before and couldn't verify their value. Again, settled out of court, the rebuilt Tremont House was a simpler design. I'm not saying these were energy devices or anything like that. I'm saying there were architectural features in pre-fire Chicago that owners valued highly, that insurance companies didn't understand, and that weren't replicated in the rebuilt city. Now here's where the pattern gets interesting. I made a list of major urban fires in North America and Europe between 1870 and 1920. The list is long, very long. Boston, November 1872. 60 acres of the city center burned, over 700 buildings destroyed. San Francisco, repeated fires throughout the 1850s, but the big one everyone knows is 1906. Earthquake and subsequent fire destroyed 80% of the city. Seattle, June 1889, entire downtown core burned. Spokane, August 1889, 32 blocks destroyed. Baltimore, February 1904, over 1,500 buildings burned. Toronto, April 1894, much of the downtown destroyed. These are just North American examples. In Europe, Hamburg had a massive fire in 1842, Bern in 1859, Constantinople in 1865, Paris during the Commune in 1871, Thessaloniki in 1917. I'm not suggesting all these fires were connected. Cities burned throughout history. Fire was a constant urban hazard before modern firefighting and building codes. What I'm noting is the concentration of major urban fires in a specific 50-year window and what happened to the architecture after each one. In almost every case, the rebuilt cities had simpler buildings, less ornate, more standardized. The elaborate passive systems largely disappeared. Again, there's a conventional explanation. Building codes improved, insurance companies demanded fireproof construction, and architects adopted steel frame and reinforced concrete methods that didn't lend themselves to the old elaborate styles. This is all documented and makes logical sense. But it also means that within 50 years, dozens of cities lost their architectural reference points. The buildings that demonstrated the most sophisticated passive systems were destroyed, and the replacements were built using different principles. If you wanted to erase a technology from common use, you couldn't ask for a better outcome. But I'm not claiming intent, I'm observing result. Let me focus on one city in detail, San Francisco. Before the 1906 earthquake and fire, San Francisco had hundreds of Victorian-era buildings, elaborate homes with complex roof lines, ornate commercial buildings, theaters with exceptional acoustics. The city's architectural character was distinctive. The earthquake hit at 5:12 a.m. on April 18, 1906. Estimated magnitude 7.9. Massive structural damage, but most of the destruction came from the fires that followed. The fires burned for 3 days. Military forces used dynamite to create fire breaks, which destroyed even more buildings. In total, about 28,000 buildings were destroyed. The city was rebuilt over the following decade. Now, here's something interesting. In the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley, there are photographs of San Francisco before the disaster. Thousands of images. When you go through them systematically, you notice architectural details. Many buildings had elaborate rooftop elements. Decorative spires, yes, but also functional-looking installations.
wind catchers for ventilation, rooftop structures that appear to be more than just decoration. I compared these photographs to the buildings that were constructed in the same locations after 1906. Almost none of the rooftop elements were replicated. The new buildings were elegant in their own way, but simpler. Flatter roofs, less vertical complexity. Was this just changing aesthetic preferences? Probably partly, but it also eliminated architectural elements we no longer understand. If those rooftop structures served functions beyond decoration, those functions were lost. There's a diary entry from a woman named Emma Burke who lived through the San Francisco disaster. She wrote about the fires and mentioned watching soldiers dynamite buildings on Van Ness Avenue to create a firebreak. She noted that some of the buildings marked for demolition seemed barely touched by fire, but were destroyed anyway. She questioned why structurally sound buildings were being demolished, but concluded that the military must have had good reasons. Maybe they did. Fire control is complicated. Sometimes you destroy good buildings to save a neighborhood. But it does mean that some buildings that could have been preserved, studied, or restored were intentionally demolished in the chaos following the earthquake. Here's where it gets more complex. I started looking at who profited from the rebuilds, not in a conspiratorial sense, just basic economic history. Large fires create massive construction booms. Fortunes are made in rebuilding. So I pulled property records and business filings from several of these cities, and a pattern emerged that I didn't expect. The same investment groups show up over and over again, the same architectural firms, the same construction companies, moving from city to city, arriving shortly after each major fire, securing contracts for the rebuild. Let me give you specifics. After the Baltimore fire of 1904, a construction syndicate called the United Railway and Electric Company secured major contracts for rebuilding infrastructure. This company was backed by investors who also had interests in the Seattle rebuild 5 years earlier and the Chicago rebuild decades before that. I'm not implying cause and effect. I'm noting that certain business entities seem to have been well positioned to benefit from urban disasters repeatedly.
The conventional explanation is that successful businesses expand geographically, and that experienced disaster recovery firms naturally get hired for subsequent disasters. That makes sense, but it also concentrates control over urban design in fewer hands, and when those firms all build using similar principles, architectural diversity decreases. After the San Francisco disaster, much of the reconstruction was financed by East Coast investment groups. They brought their preferred architectural firms. Those firms built in styles they knew. The local architectural vernacular was largely displaced. Again, not conspiracy, just economics, but the result is homogenization. Now, I want to show you something that made me pause. I pulled insurance data from multiple cities that burned. The payout patterns are interesting. In several cases, buildings with unusual architectural features were undervalued in insurance settlements. The justification was that these features were decorative and didn't add functional value. But this created a disincentive to rebuild those features. Why spend money on elaborate rooftop structures if insurance won't cover them? So the rebuilt cities lost those elements, not through conspiracy, but through insurance company risk assessment. And yet, who sets those assessments? Who decides what's valuable and what's decoration? There's another element to this that's rarely discussed. After major fires, cities often change their building codes. Again, this makes sense. You don't want to rebuild in ways that allow the same disaster to happen again. But some of the new codes specifically prohibited architectural elements that had been common before. For example, after the Boston fire of 1872, the city prohibited certain types of decorative cornice work. The official reason was that falling cornices had injured firefighters during the blaze. Fair concern, but the code was written broadly enough that it effectively banned many types of rooftop architectural elaboration. After the Baltimore fire, codes restricted building heights in ways that made elaborate vertical designs impractical. The tallest buildings with the most complex rooflines became legally unbuildable. I'm not questioning the safety motivations, but the cumulative effect of these code changes across multiple cities was the elimination of certain architectural approaches, and with them, the knowledge of how to build and maintain those systems. Here's what bothers me most.
I tried to find architectural manuals from the 1870s through 1890s that explain how these complex passive systems were designed. They should exist. Architects wrote down their methods, but they're remarkably hard to find. Libraries have plenty of books on architectural aesthetics from that period, discussions of proportion, style, ornamentation, but detailed technical manuals on passive climate systems, acoustic design, and the functional aspects of complex rooflines, they're scarce. Either they were never written, which seems unlikely given the sophistication of the buildings, or they were lost. And if they were lost, when and how?
Some of the missing documentation can be explained by the fires themselves. Many architects' offices were in city centers that burned, their working drawings, their notes, their reference materials, all destroyed. That's documented loss. But there are gaps that are harder to explain. The architectural curriculum at major universities changed between 1890 and 1920. Earlier courses included subjects like natural philosophy and harmonic proportion that later disappeared from syllabi. I found a reference to a course at Columbia University in 1885 titled Telluric Principles in Foundation Design. By 1905, there's no such course. It just vanished from the catalog with no explanation in the university records. Did the knowledge become obsolete, or was it deliberately phased out? I can't tell. The university archives don't explain why courses were dropped, only that they were. What I can say is this: between 1870 and 1920, a combination of urban fires, changing building codes, shifts in architectural education, and economic pressures from insurance and finance sectors created conditions where certain architectural approaches became impractical to continue. Whether this was intentional or accidental, the result was the same. A knowledge base was disrupted and largely lost. And right in the middle of this period, something else was happening. World's fairs, international exhibitions, massive temporary cities built to showcase the latest in architecture and technology, cities within cities, constructed in months, then demolished just as quickly. And the architecture displayed at these fairs looked a lot like the buildings that were disappearing from permanent urban landscapes. The official story about World's Fairs is that they were celebrations of progress, temporary showcases of national pride built from plaster and wood, always meant to be torn down. But when you look at the construction photographs, when you examine the building techniques and the timelines, something doesn't add up. Structures that would supposedly take years to build appeared in months. Buildings described as temporary looked more solid than many permanent structures. And after each fair, almost everything was demolished, often in suspicious haste. The Chicago World's Fair of 1893 might be the most important architectural event you've never properly questioned. The World's Columbian Exposition, Chicago, 1893. Official story, built in 2 years to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage. Over 200 buildings constructed on 630 acres, attended by 27 million people, then almost entirely demolished within a year of closing. Here's what stopped me when I first researched this: the photographs. You can find thousands of them in public archives. The Library of Congress has extensive collections. The Chicago History Museum has even more. Look at those images carefully. These are not crude temporary structures. These are massive, elaborate buildings with sophisticated architectural detailing.
The administration building had a dome that rivaled the U.S. Capitol. The Manufacturers and Liberal Arts building covered 44 acres under a single roof. 44 acres. That's one of the largest enclosed spaces ever constructed at that time. The structure used iron trusses and glass panels in a design that required sophisticated engineering. The official narrative says these were built from staff, a mixture of plaster, cement, and jute fiber over wooden frames, temporary materials designed to last just a few years. The buildings were painted white, giving the fairgrounds the nickname the White City. But here's my question.
If these were temporary structures, why the extraordinary level of architectural detail? The buildings featured columns, sculptures, ornate moldings, decorative elements that would take skilled craftsmen significant time to create. Why invest that level of craftsmanship in something meant to be destroyed? I found construction records in the Chicago Public Library archives. The fair employed over 40,000 workers at its peak. Construction began in 1891, and the fair opened in May 1893. That's roughly 2 years for the entire complex. By comparison, the Chicago Public Library building, a single permanent structure, took nearly 4 years to build during the same period. How did a temporary fair with over 200 buildings get completed in half the time it took to build one permanent library? The standard explanation is that temporary construction is faster. You're not building for longevity, so you can cut corners. Fair enough. But the photographs show construction techniques that don't look temporary. Steel frames, concrete foundations, glass and ironwork that appears substantial. There are photographs of the construction process. Workers are shown setting massive steel trusses, pouring concrete foundations, installing elaborate electrical systems. Daniel Burnham, the chief architect, wrote about the challenges of coordinating construction trades, managing material deliveries, ensuring quality control. These are the concerns of permanent construction, not temporary exhibition spaces. Here's something specific. The electricity building at the fair showcased, among other things, Nikola Tesla's alternating current system. Tesla himself was present, demonstrating wireless energy transmission. The building was equipped with thousands of electric lights. The fair was the first large-scale demonstration of electric lighting for most attendees. But the building itself had architectural features beyond just housing the electrical exhibits. The roof structure included metal elements with specific geometric arrangements. When I found the architectural drawings, I noticed annotations similar to what I'd seen in other buildings from that era, references to potential collection and charge dissipation. Was the electricity building itself part of the electrical demonstration, or were these just standard architectural elements? The drawings don't clarify.
After the fair closed, 1893, there was discussion about preserving some buildings. The Palace of Fine Arts was supposed to be kept as a museum. There were proposals to maintain the agricultural building and convert it to public use. These seemed like reasonable ideas given the effort invested in construction. Instead, most everything was demolished. Some buildings burned. The Palace of Fine Arts, which was supposed to be preserved, was destroyed by fire in 1894. Other structures were systematically torn down over the following year. The official reason was cost. Maintaining temporary buildings would be expensive. They were deteriorating due to weather. It was cheaper to demolish than to preserve. This is all documented in city records. But here's the odd part. Some of the materials salvaged from demolition were reported as being far more substantial than expected. Workers found that many temporary walls had brick and concrete behind the plaster facades. Some foundations were deeper and more robust than necessary for structures meant to last 3 years. A demolition supervisor named Frank Miller wrote a report in 1895 describing the process. He noted that some buildings were surprisingly difficult to tear down. He wrote that he'd expected the work to go quickly given the temporary nature of construction, but found instead that many structures are built with permanence in mind and require significant effort to dismantle. Why would temporary buildings be built with permanence in mind? That's contradictory unless the intentions changed during construction, or unless the temporary designation was more about planning permission and less about actual construction method. Now, the Chicago Fair was the largest, but it wasn't the only one. Between 1870 and 1915, there were dozens of major World's Fairs and international expositions, and the pattern repeats. Massive, elaborate architectural complexes built in impossibly short time frames, then demolished just as quickly. The Trans-Mississippi Exposition in Omaha, 1898. The Pan-American Exposition in Buffalo, 1901. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis, 1904. Each one followed the same pattern: rapid construction, elaborate architecture, swift demolition. And each time, photographs show buildings that look far more substantial than temporary suggests. Let me focus on the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, May to November 1901. The exposition covered 350 acres and featured elaborate electrical illumination. It was called the Rainbow City because of its colored lighting displays at night. President William McKinley was assassinated at this fair. That's the detail everyone remembers. What's less discussed is the architecture. The exposition buildings featured elaborate domes, decorative spires, extensive electrical systems for the lighting displays. Construction took 18 months. After the fair closed, almost everything was demolished. The New York State Building was supposed to be preserved. Instead, it burned in a suspicious fire in 1903. The Machinery and Transportation Building, which had housed extensive exhibits on the latest technology, was demolished despite proposals to convert it into a permanent museum.
Here's what's strange. Buffalo in 1901 was a booming industrial city with wealth from manufacturing and proximity to Niagara Falls power generation. The city could have afforded to maintain some of these structures. There were public campaigns to save certain buildings, yet the demolition proceeded systematically. I found newspaper articles from the Buffalo Evening News questioning the rush to demolish. One editorial from December 1901 asked why the city was so eager to erase the fair from existence when many structures could serve public purposes. The response from city officials was that the land was needed for development and that maintaining the buildings wasn't economically feasible. But the land sat undeveloped for years after demolition. Some parcels weren't built on until the 1920s. So the urgency to demolish seems disconnected from actual development needs. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis, 1904, had even more elaborate architecture. The Palace of Electricity alone covered 9 acres. The Palace of Machinery was 3 times larger than the largest building at the Chicago Fair. Construction photographs show foundations that look designed for permanent buildings, steel framing that seems over-engineered for temporary use, and once again, almost total demolition after the fair closed. Only one building was preserved, the Palace of Fine Arts, which still stands today as the St. Louis Art Museum. Every other structure was torn down or burned. Why preserve one but destroy all the others? I want to be clear about what I'm observing versus what I'm speculating. The observation is this: World's fairs consistently featured architecture that appeared substantial, that was built with impressive speed, and that was then systematically destroyed. This is documented fact. The speculation is about why. The official explanations are economic and practical. Temporary structures for temporary purposes. When the event ends, the buildings have no function, so they're removed. This makes logical sense. But there are details that don't quite fit. The level of craftsmanship seems excessive for temporary use. The demolition often seems rushed, even when there were proposals and funding for preservation. And the buildings themselves exhibited architectural features similar to the permanent structures that were disappearing from cities during the same period. Some researchers look at this and see a pattern of deliberate destruction. They argue that these expositions were showcasing an older architectural knowledge and that powerful interests wanted that knowledge eliminated. They point to the fact that many exposition buildings had elaborate electrical systems, passive climate control, and acoustic properties that we struggle to replicate today. Other researchers see standard economic behavior, building booms and busts, temporary construction for temporary needs, demolition when maintenance costs exceed utility. This makes logical sense. But there are details that don't quite fit. The level of craftsmanship seems excessive for temporary use. The demolition often seems rushed, even when there were proposals and funding for preservation. And the buildings themselves exhibited architectural features similar to the permanent structures that were disappearing from cities during the same period. Both groups are looking at the same photographs, the same construction records, the same demolition reports. They reach opposite conclusions. I don't know which interpretation is correct. What I do know is that these expositions represented a concentration of architectural ambition that's hard to match even today.
Entire cities built in months, featuring technologies and design elements that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible, and then erased, often before the general public could fully study and understand what had been built. There's one more element to the World's Fair story that troubles me. The architects and engineers who designed these expositions, they continued working after the fairs ended. Daniel Burnham went on to design major buildings and city plans. Many other exposition architects had long careers, but their later work was noticeably different, simpler, more conventional. The elaborate systems and design flourishes that appeared in exposition buildings rarely showed up in their subsequent projects. Why? Did economic pressures force simplification? Did changing tastes make the old elaborate style unfashionable? Or did they lose access to knowledge they'd been applying at the fairs? I interviewed a descendant of one of the engineers who worked on the Chicago Fair. They had family letters and diaries that mentioned the construction process. One letter, dated June 1892, described working on the atmospheric systems for several buildings. The engineer wrote that they were applying principles taught by the European masters, but that such systems may soon become impractical in modern commercial construction. European masters. There's that reference to older knowledge again. But which masters? From when? The letter doesn't specify. And the comment about becoming impractical, that's prescient. Within 20 years, those kinds of systems had almost entirely disappeared from new construction. Did this engineer know that was coming, or was he just noting economic trends? The letter is fragile, stored in a university archive. I asked permission to publish excerpts. The request was denied due to family privacy concerns, even though the engineer died in 1937. So the letter exists, confirms certain technical elements of construction, but remains largely inaccessible to researchers. This happens more than you'd think. Relevant documents exist in private collections or restricted archives. You can verify they're there. You can sometimes see references or brief excerpts, but full access is limited. It makes comprehensive research difficult. So, we have buildings from the 1800s with advanced passive systems. We have urban fires that destroyed many of these buildings. We have World's Fairs that showcased similar architecture, then demolished it. Each element has conventional explanations that make sense individually, but taken together, they form a pattern. Knowledge was being applied, then that knowledge became inaccessible. Whether through accident or design, we can debate, but the result is clear. Architectural approaches that were once widespread became rare, then vanished. And the official timeline we're taught about technological progress doesn't quite account for what we can see in photographs and building records. Which brings us to the question nobody wants to address directly. Did someone rewrite the timeline? And if so, why?
Let me show you a photograph. It's from the Detroit Public Library collection, dated 1864. The image shows a street in downtown Detroit. The buildings are elaborate, multi-story structures with ornate facades, detailed stonework, complex roof lines. The photograph quality is clear enough to make out architectural details. Now, the official history of Detroit says that in 1864, the city was still recovering from being a frontier town. The major architectural boom didn't happen until the 1880s and 90s. Yet here's photographic evidence of substantial, sophisticated architecture existing 2 decades earlier than the narrative suggests. I'm not saying the official timeline is wrong. I'm saying there's a discrepancy between what we're told existed and what photographs show existed. This pattern repeats across multiple cities. Photographs show elaborate architecture existing earlier than official timelines suggest cities were wealthy or developed enough to support such construction. The standard explanation is that our historical understanding isn't perfect, that there were periods of rapid development that aren't fully documented, and that buildings were sometimes misdated in records. All plausible, but it means our confidence in the timeline should be lower than it typically is. Here's a specific example. The Smithsonian Institution building, known as the Castle in Washington, D.C. Construction is officially dated to between 1846 and 1855. That's 9 years to build a single building.
The design is elaborate, featuring multiple towers, intricate stonework, advanced ventilation systems built into the walls. The building still stands today. When it underwent renovation in the 1970s, engineers studied the construction. Their report noted that the ventilation system was more sophisticated than expected from mid-19th century design. The stonework showed techniques that were thought to have been developed later. The report concluded that either the construction period was longer than 9 years, allowing for more advanced techniques to be incorporated as they developed, or that the dating might not be entirely accurate. The report didn't challenge the official dates, it just noted anomalies. But those anomalies suggest our chronological confidence might be misplaced. Let me give you another case, the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. Official construction date, 1821 to 1836. The design includes a radial spoke pattern, advanced for its time. Each cell block radiates from a central hub, allowing for surveillance and efficient circulation. But here's what's interesting. The building also includes sophisticated plumbing, individual heating systems for cells, and acoustic properties that allow guards in the central hub to hear disturbances in distant cell blocks. These features require engineering knowledge that was supposedly cutting edge in the 1830s.
When you tour the facility today, guides explain that the architect, John Haviland, was a genius ahead of his time. He designed systems that wouldn't become common for decades. That's the official interpretation. But there's another possibility. Maybe the systems weren't ahead of their time. Maybe they were standard for a building type we don't fully understand. Maybe Haviland was applying existing knowledge rather than inventing new knowledge. I can't prove that, but I can point out that calling someone a genius ahead of their time is a way of explaining anomalies without questioning the timeline. Here's where this gets more complicated. Architectural dating is usually based on records, building permits, newspaper articles about construction, dedication ceremonies, that kind of documentation. But what happens when those records are incomplete or contradictory? In dozens of cases I've examined, there are discrepancies between different sources about when a building was constructed, sometimes by just a few years, sometimes by decades. And we tend to trust whichever source seems most authoritative without necessarily verifying that authority. Let me show you what I mean. The Los Angeles City Hall. Official completion date, 1928. But there are photographs in the Huntington Library collection that appear to show the building, or something very similar, in images dated 1905. The structure in those early photographs has the same basic form, the same location, similar architectural features. The official explanation is that those photographs are misdated, or that they show a different building that was demolished to make room for the current City Hall. Both are possible. Photograph dating can be unreliable, buildings get replaced. But when I tried to find records of what buildings stood on that site before 1928, the documentation is sparse. There are references to municipal buildings in that location in the early 1900s, but no detailed descriptions or architectural drawings that I could locate. Did a building similar to the current City Hall exist there earlier? I can't definitively say, but the photographs raise questions that aren't fully answered. Now, you might be thinking, so what? Buildings that renovated, expanded, rebuilt on the same footprint, dating discrepancies happen. All true, but when you find these discrepancies across many buildings in many cities, it starts to form a pattern. Either our dating methods are less reliable than we think, or some buildings are older than official records indicate. There's a more radical interpretation that some researchers propose. They argue that many 19th century buildings are actually much older, that they're remnants of a more advanced civilization that existed before our current historical timeline acknowledges. They point to the architectural sophistication, the advanced systems, the knowledge that seems too advanced for the stated construction period. They suggest that the timeline itself has been deliberately altered to hide this earlier civilization. This is where we enter highly controversial territory. I want to be very clear, I'm not endorsing that interpretation. I'm noting that it exists and that it's based on observations of real discrepancies in the historical record. The mainstream historical position is that all these buildings were built when records say they were built, that the sophistication represents the work of talented people applying developing knowledge, and that any discrepancies are due to incomplete documentation or dating errors. Both positions are attempting to explain the same evidence. The evidence being buildings with capabilities that seem advanced for their stated construction period, chronological discrepancies in some records, and knowledge transmission that's poorly documented. The mainstream position requires accepting that there were numerous architectural geniuses working simultaneously across different countries who all somehow arrived at similar advanced techniques independently or through poorly documented knowledge sharing. The alternative position requires accepting that a major civilization existed and then disappeared from historical records through some combination of destruction and chronological manipulation. Neither explanation is simple. Both have elements that are hard to verify. What we can verify is this. The architectural record is more complex than the standard narrative suggests. There are buildings that don't quite fit the timeline we're taught. There are capabilities demonstrated in older buildings that we struggle to replicate with modern technology. And there are significant gaps in documentation about how this knowledge was transmitted and why it disappeared. Let me give you one more specific case before we move forward. The Palace of Westminster in London, home of the British Parliament. The current building is officially dated to mid-19th century, replacing an earlier structure that burned in 1834. The architect, Charles Barry, designed an elaborate Gothic revival building with over 1,000 rooms, precise acoustic engineering for the debate chambers, and sophisticated ventilation that uses the central tower to draw air through the entire complex. Construction took decades and required engineering solutions that were supposedly at the cutting edge of Victorian technology. But here's the thing. When you examine the foundation work and some of the structural elements, there's evidence of much older construction techniques. Some researchers suggest that Barry didn't build entirely new, but rather renovated and expanded an earlier structure that was far older than the 1834 fire suggests. The problem with this kind of analysis is that it's almost impossible to definitively prove or disprove without destructive archaeological investigation, which isn't going to happen with an active government building. So we're left with competing interpretations of partial evidence. This is the frustrating reality of architectural historical research. The buildings exist. They demonstrate certain capabilities. They show evidence of sophisticated knowledge, but the documentation of who built them, how, and when is often incomplete or contradictory. Standard history fills those gaps with the most conventional explanation. Alternative researchers fill those gaps with more radical theories. Neither side has perfect evidence. What both sides agree on is that something doesn't quite add up. The buildings are more capable than they should be according to the timeline we're taught. The knowledge that created them is poorly documented. And in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there was a widespread shift away from these architectural approaches. Whether that shift represents progress, loss, or something more complex is the question. And it leads us to a very specific historical moment when the old architecture and new technology came into direct conflict. Because there was one man who understood both worlds, who tried to bridge the gap between them, and who was systematically stopped from doing so. Nikola Tesla arrived in America in 1884 with almost nothing. Within 2 decades, he'd revolutionized electrical systems and was working on wireless power transmission that could have made energy free for everyone. His Wardenclyffe Tower was designed using principles that looked suspiciously similar to the old architecture we've been discussing. And then, at the moment it might have actually worked, his funding was cut, his tower was demolished, and his papers were confiscated. The official story blames business competition, but when you look at who killed his funding and why, and when you see what happened to his research afterward, you start to realize this might have been the most important technological suppression in modern history. Nikola Tesla filed for a U.S. patent on a system of electric lighting in 1885, just a year after arriving in America. Over his career, he would file over 300 patents. Many revolutionized electrical engineering, some remain mysterious even today. The patent that interests me most is number 645576, filed in 1900. It's titled Apparatus for the Utilization of Radiant Energy. The design shows a metal plate elevated above ground, connected through a capacitor to a grounding path. The description explains that the plate collects energy from the atmosphere, stores it in the capacitor, and can release it as electrical power. Sound familiar? It's essentially the same principle I described finding in architectural plans from the 1870s and 80s. A conductive element elevated above ground, a storage system, and a ground return path. Tesla was patenting what architects had apparently been building into structures for decades. Was he copying them? Or was he the originator and they were copying him? The chronology is ambiguous. Tesla was working on electrical systems in Europe before he came to America. He could have been developing these ideas parallel to the architectural applications, or earlier, or later. The documentation doesn't clarify the sequence of invention versus application. What's clear is that by the late 1890s, Tesla believed he could transmit electrical power wirelessly through the atmosphere and the Earth itself. He called it his world system. The idea was to eliminate power lines entirely. Energy would be broadcast from transmitters and received by relatively simple receivers anywhere on Earth.
In 1898, he demonstrated a wireless power transmission over short distances. He lit electric lamps without any physical connection to a power source. The demonstration was witnessed and documented. It worked. Then he proposed building a large-scale transmitter to prove the concept could work over long distances. He found a financial backer, J.P. Morgan, one of the wealthiest men in America. Morgan gave Tesla $150,000 to build a prototype. That's equivalent to about $5 million today. Tesla purchased land in Shoreham, New York, and began construction on Wardenclyffe Tower in 1901. The tower was designed as a massive transmitter. It featured a large mushroom-shaped dome on top of a tall wooden tower structure. Below ground, there was an extensive foundation system with iron pipes driven deep into the earth. Here's where it connects to architecture. The design of Wardenclyffe has striking similarities to buildings we've discussed: an elevated conductive dome, a tower structure, an elaborate grounding system going deep into the earth. It looks like someone took the architectural elements we've been seeing and scaled them up into a dedicated electrical device. When construction was underway, Tesla gave interviews describing the system. He talked about using the Earth itself as a conductor, about drawing power from the atmosphere, about resonance and frequency. He described the tower as a tuned system that would resonate with natural electrical phenomena. But in 1903, when the tower was nearly complete, J.P. Morgan withdrew funding. Construction stopped. Tesla scrambled to find other investors but couldn't secure enough backing. The tower was never completed to Tesla's specifications. Why did Morgan pull out? The official story is that he became skeptical of the commercial viability. Tesla had promised wireless communication, which could be profitable. But as the project progressed, Tesla started emphasizing wireless power transmission, which Morgan apparently saw as impossible to monetize. How do you charge people for power if they can pull it from the air anywhere? That's the standard narrative. Business decision. Morgan wanted profit, Tesla wanted to give away free energy, so Morgan cut funding. It's a compelling story about capitalism versus idealism. But there are other details. Around the same time Morgan withdrew from Wardenclyffe, he was heavily invested in copper mining and electrical infrastructure companies. The expansion of the electrical grid required massive amounts of copper wire. Power lines stretching across the country represented huge ongoing revenue. If wireless power actually worked, it would eliminate that entire industry. Did Morgan realize that Tesla's system threatened his other investments? Possibly. There's no document where Morgan explicitly states this, but the financial conflict is obvious in retrospect. After funding was cut, Tesla spent years trying to revive the project. He gave lectures about wireless power. He demonstrated small-scale versions of the technology. He wrote about the future potential. But he never got the backing to complete Wardenclyffe.
The tower stood incomplete for over a decade. In 1917, during World War I, the U.S. government declared the structure a security risk, claiming it could be used for espionage. The military demolished the tower using dynamite. The dome was sold for scrap. The underground foundation was partially dismantled. Here's what bothers me about the official story. Tesla was not an unknown crank. By 1900, he was famous. His AC electrical system was powering cities. He had powerful connections. Yet he couldn't find anyone willing to fund completing a project that could revolutionize energy? In an era of massive industrial expansion and robber baron fortunes, nobody wanted to invest in potential free energy? That seems odd unless there was active resistance. And when you look at who controlled energy infrastructure and who had the most to lose from wireless power, a pattern emerges. Let me give you specifics. After Wardenclyffe failed, Tesla's career declined. He continued inventing and filing patents, but he never again had access to the kind of funding or facilities he'd had earlier. He died in 1943 in a New York hotel room, in debt and largely forgotten by the public. Immediately after his death, the FBI seized all his papers and personal effects. This is documented. The official reason was national security during wartime. Tesla had been working on what he called a death ray and other weapons systems. The government wanted to ensure his research didn't fall into enemy hands. Fair enough during a war, but here's the thing. Those papers were never fully returned to public access. Some were eventually released to Tesla's family and to museums, but researchers who've studied the available documents note that there are significant gaps. References to experiments that should have corresponding notes, mentions of data that isn't in the archive. The inventory done at the time of seizure lists materials that weren't included in later releases. Where did those missing documents go? The FBI says everything of significance was eventually released. Researchers who've gone through the archive say that's not accurate. There are clearly missing pieces. Now, some researchers take this and run toward conspiracy. They argue that Tesla had rediscovered ancient free energy systems, that his work threatened the entire power generation industry, and that powerful interests actively suppressed his research and destroyed the evidence. They point to Wardenclyffe's similarity to old architecture as proof that Tesla was tapping into lost knowledge, and they see the demolition of the tower and the seizure of his papers as deliberate suppression. That's one interpretation. The mainstream view is simpler. Tesla was a brilliant but impractical inventor, whose ideas often exceeded what was technological or economically feasible. Wardenclyffe failed because the technology didn't work as promised and because the business model was unsound. His papers were seized for security during wartime, and most were eventually released. Any missing documents were likely destroyed as unimportant or lost through bureaucratic mishap. Both interpretations use the same facts, they just weight them differently. What we can verify is this. Tesla was working on wireless power transmission. He built a tower designed to demonstrate the concept. The tower incorporated design elements similar to buildings we've been discussing. Funding was withdrawn at a critical point. The tower was demolished. Tesla's research was seized after his death and not fully returned to public access. Whether this represents suppression of revolutionary technology or the natural failure of an impractical idea depends on whether the technology actually worked. And that's the question nobody can definitively answer. Did Wardenclyffe work? Could it have worked if completed? Tesla said yes. His financial backers said no. The tower was destroyed before it could be fully tested, so we'll never know for certain. But here's something we do know. The architectural elements Tesla was using, the domes and grounding systems, those existed in buildings for decades before Wardenclyffe, and many of those buildings were demolished or modified around the same time Tesla's tower was destroyed. Coincidence or pattern? There's one more element to the Tesla story that connects to everything we've discussed. Tesla wrote and spoke about studying in Europe, about learning from old masters, about architectural principles that went back centuries. He mentions specific buildings that had influenced his thinking. The problem is that many of the buildings he referenced were either destroyed or significantly modified in the early 20th century, so we can't go back and examine what Tesla saw. We can't verify what elements he might have been studying. The reference points are gone. Let me give you a specific example. Tesla mentioned studying the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople during his time in Europe. He wrote that the building's dome structure demonstrated harmonic resonance that influenced his thinking on wireless transmission. The Hagia Sophia still exists, but it's been modified extensively over the centuries. The dome Tesla saw in the late 1800s underwent renovations. Some of the internal structural elements were changed. We can't fully reconstruct what Tesla observed. This pattern repeats. Buildings that Tesla mentioned as influences were often modified, demolished, or made inaccessible shortly after he referenced them. Again, this could be pure coincidence. Buildings get renovated. But it means that verifying Tesla's claims about what he learned from architecture is nearly impossible now. And this brings us full circle. We started with buildings that demonstrate advanced capabilities. We've traced how many of those buildings were destroyed or modified. We've seen how World's Fairs showcased similar architecture, then demolished it. We've noted chronological discrepancies and knowledge gaps, and now we see that the one modern inventor who explicitly connected old architecture to new technology has his work stopped and his reference points eliminated. Each individual element has conventional explanations, but the cumulative pattern suggests something more systematic was happening. So what do we do with this information? How do we separate historical fact from speculation? And more importantly, what's happening right now with the buildings that remain? Because this isn't just ancient history. There are still structures from that era standing in cities around the world. And when you look at how they're being treated, what's being discovered during renovations, and what information is being restricted, you realize the story isn't over. In fact, it might be entering a new phase.
There's a restoration project happening right now at the Biltmore Estate in North Carolina. The mansion, completed in 1895, is America's largest privately owned home. 250 rooms, 175,000 square feet. Built by George Vanderbilt with the wealth of the Gilded Age. The restoration work is extensive. They're updating electrical systems, reinforcing foundations, preserving architectural details. Standard maintenance for a historic building of that scale. But something interesting came up during the work. Contractors found a network of copper pipes running through the walls. The pipes don't connect to the plumbing system. They don't carry water or gas. They run from the roofline down through the structure into the ground. Some of the pipes have unusual fittings. Some contain what appears to be crystalline material. The restoration team documented these findings and submitted a report to the estate management. I requested a copy through a researcher contact. The request was denied. I was told the report contains proprietary information about the building's systems and isn't available for public review. Proprietary information about pipes in a building from 1895? What could possibly be proprietary about century-old construction? This isn't an isolated case. Similar situations have occurred during renovations of other historic buildings. Strange architectural elements are discovered. They don't match modern understanding of the building's purpose. They get documented internally, but the information isn't released publicly. Why the secrecy around buildings that are over a century old? Let me give you another current example. The U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C. is undergoing ongoing preservation work. In 2019, during foundation stabilization, workers found chambers beneath the building that weren't on any architectural plans. Underground rooms, carefully constructed, some with ventilation shafts to the surface. The discovery was mentioned briefly in a construction update, then no further information was released. I filed a Freedom of Information Act request for details, denied on grounds of building security. Security about underground chambers from the 1800s? Here's the pattern I'm seeing. When renovations or archaeological work uncovers unexpected elements in these old buildings, there's a consistent response. Initial documentation, then restriction of information. The public gets confirmation that something was found, but details remain limited. Sometimes the restriction makes sense.
Security concerns about government buildings are legitimate, but the pattern extends to private buildings, churches, museums, structures where security can't be the real issue. So what's the actual concern? One possibility is that finding unexplained architectural elements raises questions about our historical understanding. If a building contains systems we can't explain, it suggests our knowledge of that period is incomplete. For institutions responsible for historical education, that's uncomfortable. Easier to restrict information than to acknowledge gaps in understanding.
Another possibility is economic. Historic buildings are tourist attractions. Revenue depends on maintaining certain narratives about their construction and purpose. If discoveries contradict those narratives, it could affect visitor experience and income, so unusual findings get downplayed or kept internal. A third possibility, and this is where we enter more speculative territory, is that there's deliberate suppression of evidence that would challenge the technological timeline we're taught, that these buildings contain functional systems we don't want to acknowledge because it would raise questions about what else might be inaccurate in our historical narrative. I can't prove which explanation is correct, but I can document that information restriction is happening. There's also the matter of what's being done to buildings under the guise of restoration. In multiple cases, restoration work has involved removing original architectural elements and replacing them with modern equivalents. The official reason is usually structural safety or code compliance, but sometimes the elements being removed are the most unusual, the hardest to explain. Ornate metalwork on roofs, complex ventilation systems, underground chambers. These get simplified or eliminated during restoration, and once they're gone, they can't be studied. Let me give you a specific case. The Philadelphia City Hall underwent major renovations in the early 2000s. Part of the work involved the tower and its metallic elements. Photographs from before the renovation show elaborate copper and iron work at the top of the tower, including what appeared to be a complex array of metal rods in geometric arrangements. After renovation, the tower top was simplified. The restoration team said the old metalwork was corroded and unsafe. They replaced it with new copper cladding that replicated the general appearance, but not the specific configuration of the original elements. I spoke with one of the metalworkers involved in the project. Off the record, he told me the old metalwork wasn't as corroded as the official reports claimed. Much of it could have been preserved, but the decision was made to replace rather than restore. He said he wasn't told why, just given specifications for the new work. So now the original configuration is gone. We have photographs, but we can't examine the actual physical structure to understand how it was built or what it might have been doing. This happens during restorations across multiple buildings. Original elements are replaced. The replacements look similar, but don't maintain the exact specifications of the originals. And once replaced, the originals are typically scrapped, not preserved for study. Then there's the matter of what's happening underground. In several cities, there are tunnel and chamber systems beneath old buildings that aren't fully mapped or accessible to researchers. These aren't sewer systems or subway tunnels. They're architectural features built into the original structures. But access is restricted, often for safety reasons. In some cases, entire tunnel networks have been sealed or filled in during modern development. The official explanation is that they're unstable and pose collapse risks, but skeptics note that this eliminates any chance of studying what these spaces were for.
New York City has extensive underground chambers beneath some of its oldest buildings. There are documented references to these spaces in 19th century records. Some were wine cellars, some were storage, but some have features that don't match simple storage function. Ventilation systems, unusual acoustic properties, connections to other buildings through tunnels. There have been proposals to map and study these spaces comprehensively. The proposals get rejected. Too expensive, too dangerous, might interfere with modern building foundations. All plausible reasons, but the result is that we don't have a full understanding of what exists beneath our oldest cities. And when development requires excavation, any historical elements found are typically documented briefly, then destroyed or sealed to allow construction to proceed. There's no systematic preservation or study.
Let me tie this back to energy. Some researchers believe that the old buildings with their domes and grounding systems were part of a distributed energy network, that they collected atmospheric electricity and used it for lighting or other purposes, that the underground chambers and tunnels were part of this system, perhaps for grounding or for distributing collected energy between buildings. This is speculation, but it's speculation based on observing architectural elements that seem to serve no obvious purpose according to conventional understanding. Copper networks through walls, deep grounding systems, underground chambers with ventilation but no clear storage function. If these elements were part of an energy system, and if that system worked, even partially, it would have profound implications. It would mean that we had functional energy technology in the late 1800s that we've since lost. It would raise questions about why it was lost, and it would suggest that our current energy infrastructure, based on centralized generation and distribution, might not be the only or even the best approach. That's a lot of ifs, and proving any of it would require access to buildings and elements that are increasingly restricted or eliminated. This is why I'm asking you to engage with this research, not to accept any particular theory, but to ask questions. When historic buildings in your city undergo renovation, ask what's being found and what's being preserved. Request access to reports. If access is denied, ask why. The more people asking these questions, the harder it becomes to restrict information without good reason. If this investigation has raised questions for you, if you want to see where this research goes next, subscribe to this channel, because I'm not done. There are specific buildings I'm working to access. There are documents I'm trying to get declassified, and I'll be sharing what I find. But I need your engagement to demonstrate that people care about these questions. Let me show you one more current situation. There's a church in Boston, built in the 1870s. It's scheduled for renovation. The architectural firm handling the project released preliminary plans showing that they'll be removing the original dome structure and replacing it with a simplified modern version. The reason given is structural concerns.
But a group of local historians examined the building and say the dome is structurally sound. They argue that the renovation is unnecessary and will destroy an important architectural element. They've filed to have the church designated as a historic landmark, which would restrict what changes can be made. The architectural firm and the church ownership are fighting the landmark designation. They argue that the building needs modernization to remain functional, that the old dome doesn't meet current safety codes, that preserving every old element isn't practical. Both sides have legitimate points. Safety matters, but so does preservation. The conflict illustrates a larger tension. When old buildings contain elements we don't fully understand, do we preserve them for study, or do we update them for contemporary use? More often than not, contemporary use wins. The buildings get updated, the unusual elements get removed, and we lose the opportunity to study them. I'm not saying every old building should be frozen in time. I'm saying that when we find architectural elements we can't explain, we should study them before we destroy them. That seems like a reasonable standard, but it's not the standard being applied. Now, there's one more element to this that I find deeply troubling. In the past decade, there's been an increase in fires affecting historic buildings. Notre Dame in Paris in 2019, the National Museum of Brazil in 2018, multiple churches and historic structures across Europe and North America. Some of these are clearly accidental. Old buildings have old electrical systems. Fire risk is real. But the frequency seems high, and in several cases, the buildings that burned were ones with unusual architectural features that researchers had been trying to study. Am I suggesting arson? I'm noting a statistical pattern and saying it's worth investigation. When buildings that could answer historical questions keep burning, it's reasonable to ask whether that's entirely accidental. Notre Dame is a useful case study. The cathedral, completed in the 13th century, had acoustic properties that modern engineers struggle to explain. The stone vaulting created resonances at specific frequencies. The space could carry plain chant throughout the entire structure without amplification. The exact reasons for this acoustic quality weren't fully understood. After the fire, there was discussion about how to rebuild. Some argued for faithful restoration, recreating the medieval structure as exactly as possible. Others argued for modern reinterpretation. The final decision leaned toward restoration, but with modifications. The new spire will not be an exact replica of the 19th century version that burned. Some of the internal structures will be rebuilt using modern materials and techniques. This means that even if Notre Dame is restored, it won't be the same building. The acoustic properties might not be replicated. The specific architectural elements that made it unique might not return.
Is this necessary? The people making the decisions say yes. Critics say it's a lost opportunity to understand medieval construction techniques. Both sides claim to care about the building's legacy. They just disagree about what preservation means. And this is the core tension running through everything we've discussed. We have buildings from the past that demonstrate capabilities we don't fully understand. We have incomplete historical documentation about how they were built and why. We have a pattern of those buildings being destroyed, modified, or restricted from study. And we have current decisions being made that continue to eliminate evidence rather than preserve it. At what point does pattern become policy? At what point do we acknowledge that there might be deliberate decisions being made about what historical information is accessible and what isn't? Let me be clear about what I am and am not claiming. I'm not claiming there's a shadowy organization controlling all of this. I'm not saying there's a conspiracy stretching back centuries. What I'm observing is more mundane, but perhaps more concerning. A series of individual decisions made by different people for different reasons that collectively result in the loss of historical knowledge. Building owners choose demolition over preservation because it's cheaper. Renovation firms choose modern replacements over historical accuracy because it's safer legally. Archives restrict access to documents because they're understaffed and overwhelmed. Government agencies classify information because it's easier than reviewing what could be public. Researchers don't ask certain questions because they risk their credibility in academic circles. None of these individual decisions require conspiracy, but the cumulative effect is that information is lost. Questions go unasked, and our understanding of the past remains incomplete. And that incompleteness serves certain interests. If we don't understand how old buildings achieved their capabilities, we can't replicate those capabilities. If we can't replicate them, we remain dependent on current technologies and the industries that control them. If we don't question the historical timeline, we don't challenge the narrative of continuous linear progress that justifies current power structures. Again, this doesn't require conspiracy. It just requires that people with power to make decisions about historical preservation happen to benefit from those decisions limiting certain kinds of knowledge. I realize how this sounds. It sounds paranoid. It sounds like I'm seeing patterns where there are only coincidences. Maybe I am. That's why I keep emphasizing that I'm observing, not concluding. I'm asking questions, not providing answers. But I also think there are legitimate reasons to question the standard historical narrative about architecture and technology. The buildings exist. They demonstrate capabilities. The documentation is incomplete. The knowledge has been lost. These are facts, not speculation. How we interpret those facts is up for debate, but the debate can't happen if we don't acknowledge the facts exist. So here's what I'm asking. Look at the old buildings in your city, not just as tourist attractions or architectural eye candy. Look at them as evidence. What systems do they have? What capabilities do they demonstrate? What questions do they raise? And then ask why those questions aren't being asked more widely. If you find this line of inquiry valuable, if you think these questions matter, leave a comment below. Share your own observations about historic buildings. Tell me about unusual architectural elements you've noticed. Point me toward buildings that need more research. And subscribe, because this investigation continues. I'm planning a follow-up examining specific buildings in detail, bringing in engineers and architects to analyze what we can observe and what it might mean. Your engagement determines whether that happens. The more people asking these questions, the harder it is to ignore them. The truth is, I don't know the full answer to the question I started with. Why do old buildings have advanced technology? Maybe they don't. Maybe what looks advanced to me is just good design by talented people. Maybe the sophistication I see in passive systems is impressive but not mysterious.
Maybe the knowledge was lost through normal historical processes and there's nothing suspicious about it. Or maybe there's more to the story. Maybe the timeline we're taught isn't entirely accurate. Maybe architectural knowledge was more advanced in the past than we acknowledge. Maybe that knowledge was deliberately suppressed, or maybe it was accidentally lost. Maybe some people know more than they're sharing, or maybe we're all honestly confused. I don't have the answer, but I think the question is worth asking. And I think the evidence is worth examining without immediately dismissing it as conspiracy theory or accepting it as definitive proof. Because ultimately, this is about how we understand our past and what possibilities that understanding opens or closes for our future. If we believe that our ancestors were less capable than us, that knowledge has progressed linearly from primitive to advanced, that anything old must be inferior to anything new, then we limit what we think is possible. We assume that current approaches are the best approaches simply because they're current. But if we acknowledge that knowledge can be lost, that the past might have had capabilities we don't fully understand, that the timeline might be more complex than we're taught, then we open up different possibilities. We might look at old technologies with fresh eyes. We might question whether modern approaches are actually optimal. We might be more willing to investigate alternative methods that don't fit current paradigms. That's the real value of this inquiry, regardless of what the specific answers turn out to be. It's about maintaining intellectual curiosity, about questioning narratives, about looking at evidence and asking what it actually shows rather than what we're told it shows. The buildings are still standing. The photographs exist. The documents, incomplete as they are, can be examined. The questions are real, even if the answers are uncertain. So I leave you with this. What if the old buildings really do have something to teach us? What if the knowledge that built them wasn't primitive, but sophisticated in ways we've forgotten?
What if understanding that knowledge could change how we approach architecture, energy, technology, and history itself? And conversely, what if the standard narrative is correct? What if these are just well-built old structures and I'm reading too much into architectural quirks? What if the knowledge was simply lost through normal historical processes and there's nothing mysterious about it? Both possibilities are worth considering. Both deserve investigation, and neither should be accepted or rejected without examining the evidence. The question isn't whether you believe one interpretation or another. The question is whether you're willing to look at the evidence yourself and make up your own mind. Because that's what's really at stake here, not whether there was a lost civilization or whether energy was free in the 1800s. What's at stake is whether we're willing to question what we're taught, examine what we can observe, and draw our own conclusions. That's the real advanced technology these old buildings might represent, not mysterious energy systems, but the technology of critical thinking, of observation over assumption, of questions over answers. And maybe that's the knowledge that's really being hidden, not in secret documents or underground chambers, but in plain sight in the buildings all around us, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see what's actually there. So look, question, investigate, and decide for yourself what you believe. What's the truth about Tartarian architecture and advanced technology in old buildings? I honestly don't know. But I think finding out is worth the effort. And I think the answer, whatever it is, matters more than we realize. Here's what I want you to think about. If these buildings really did have advanced systems that we've lost, who benefits from us not knowing? And if they didn't, if it's all just misinterpretation and pattern seeking, who benefits from us questioning anyway? Either way, someone's worldview is challenged. Either way, asking the question changes how we see the past. So which makes you more uncomfortable? The possibility that our history has been simplified and sanitized? Or the possibility that we're seeing patterns where none exist? Your answer to that question might tell you more about the truth than any documentary ever could. What do you believe?
And more importantly, why?